Welcome. I'm Megan Brown, and I'm joined by my partners John Bird and Matt Gardner, who make up part of our multidisciplinary cybersecurity practice. And we are here to talk about executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which President Biden issued on May 12th. There is a lot in this executive order, and so we're just going to dive in. Matt and John, thank you guys for joining today.
Glad to be here.
I'm always happy to do a podcast, Megan and Matt.
Well, there we go. So just to table set sort of how we got here, right? I think most of our listeners would be familiar with the SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline incidents. But just to give sort of a thumbnail sketch of that, SolarWinds sort of evolved in the winter and in the spring, and it was what a lot of folks are referring to as sort of a supply chain hack or incident where a very prominent and large U.S. IT company that provides network management tools to both U.S. government and private business customers suffered a compromise of its systems that enabled malicious code to be injected into software updates that were used for one of its network management platforms. Without getting into all the gory details, basically that compromised software update enabled malicious actors to then have access to and install more malware in the customers of SolarWinds. And there were many thousands of companies that were affected. This was seen as, I think, conventional wisdom is this was mostly a surveillance type attack rather than sort of exploited for real, harm in any way. But it shined a light on the vulnerabilities that folks now see in the software supply chain is sort of how I think a lot of people are approaching it, which is this was not a company that was housed in a foreign adversary. It's not sort of your traditional threat actor. It was compromised and it had some very profound ripple effects through its customer base. And so that sort of ratcheted up the already existing scrutiny of software security and the importance of software supply chain. Then more recently, we had the Colonial Pipeline incident in which United States officials have said this dark side ransomware group, which is kind of ransomware as a service, was able to perpetrate an attack on Colonial Pipeline, which provides tons of support to the East Coast. And this highlighted some concerns about the bleed over between IT and OT, information technology and operational technology. There's a lot we still don't know about the Colonial Pipeline incident, although we do know that they paid a substantial ransom. They did have to shut down operations, which made a lot of my neighbors freak out about getting gas. Turns out that was not as dire as the internets wanted us to believe. But it also has focused a lot of policymakers on cybersecurity and these hard questions about, what should be the government's interest in payment of ransom and how can the United States put together a more cohesive cybersecurity posture. So fast forward to this executive order. We're now just 2 weeks out from it. It has a lot going on in it and is born of, I think, the urgency perhaps was expedited by these two events, but certainly the Government Accountability Office has criticized the government repeatedly for its cybersecurity posture. And we're now coming up on 10 to 15 years of public-private partnership between the government and the private sector. So we're kind of at an inflection point on federal cybersecurity policy into which this executive order drops. And it really focuses on the federal government's cybersecurity as a customer and as an actor, as well as sort of nudging the private sector. And so we're going to be using a lot of acronyms, and Matt and John and I are going to try and slow it down. A few key agencies are going to be NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, CISA, which is the cybersecurity organization within DHS, and then the FAR Council, the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council. And so I think we're just going to dive on in because there's a lot to talk about. And Matt, let's start with you. Can you sort of give us your reaction to the changes in this executive order, both for federal government and for federal contractors?
Yeah, the first thing that jumps out is that the EO here is very ambitious and is designed to have a broad scope and a pretty significant impact. Obviously, it's an executive order, and it's mainly targeted at federal agencies and federal government contractors. But I'll note two parts about that. First, with respect to federal contractors, it's not totally clear who is going to be subject to which parts of the EO. For instance, the EO has a lot of requirements for service providers, but it's not clear who's considered a service provider. And at different places, the EO talks about IT and OT service providers, and then in other places it talks about ICT service providers. Those terms aren't defined, and it's not totally clear if those are intended to be two distinct groups or what the overlap between those will be. At other places, the EO appears to cover all or maybe nearly all government contractors. For example, the EO talks about creating standardized cybersecurity contract language for contractors, but the EO defers to the FAR Council to consider the scope of contractors and associated service providers to be covered by the proposed contract language. So that's a fairly significant unknown. I could see that portion of the EO applying to a very broad set of contractors, perhaps something like the FAR Basic Safeguarding Clause that applies to any contractor that processes federal information. So a lot of unknowns with respect to which parts of the EO are going to apply to which federal contractors. The second big piece about this, which Megan, you alluded to, is that the EO is clearly designed to attempt to push the private sector and to create new cybersecurity expectations for the private sector in some places. The EO talks expressly about the federal government needing to lead the private sector and calls out the private sector, saying that outdated security models and unencrypted data have led to compromises of systems in the public and private sectors, and that the federal government must lead the way and increase its adoption of security best practices. So I think that's going to be one of the main themes as we walk through the EO today. The administration is clearly hoping that this EO is going to be a game changer for cyber expectations for the private sector. But the real first critical step is whether or not the federal government can actually do everything that's in this EO and on those timeframes. And the federal government, as we know, doesn't always have the best track record with respect to cybersecurity. So it'll be curious to see if they can meet the expectations they've set for themselves in this. So with that, I think, John, we'll turn to you to jump in and talk about one of the more substantive areas, cloud service providers. There's a lot of different parts in here about a push to a more secure cloud providers for the federal government, and also language addressing possibly reevaluating FedRAMP. What's going on here, John?
Yeah, well, I think this is part of a broader trend that the government has seen and government contractors have experienced over the last 10 years as more and more federal contractors are migrating to the cloud. The cloud's becoming a safer space for them to operate. And take DoD, for example, as DoD has pushed more stringent cybersecurity requirements on its contractors over the last, say, decade. I think a lot of those contractors have made the business decision that it is more efficient and more economical for them to be in the cloud, or at least to have the portion of their operations that deal with sensitive government information to be in the cloud, and to push some of the technology investment that comes with meeting DoD cybersecurity requirements, pushing some of that investment to the cloud and just riding on some of the cloud infrastructure that exists. So what we've seen in the DoD space is that there's been this fairly mass migration to cloud-based operations. And I get the sense that the government is in favor of that. I think that it streamlines a lot of the cybersecurity apparatus, the infrastructure. It consolidates some of the technological investment that needs to be made. It consolidates some of the threat detection and the reporting piece. So there's a net benefit to the government of being in the cloud. The contractors, like I said, they are making business decisions that it's just more efficient and better business for them to push these operations into the cloud. So if that's where everything seems to be heading, and I think if we put on our look into the future glasses, 5-10 years from now, that's where I expect everything will be moving. It makes sense to try and get ahead of that now and to start establishing some common core, if you will, cyber hygiene for all of these cloud service providers. FedRAMP, you mentioned, has been the backbone of federal cloud certification and approval processes for the last decade or so. And so it's the logical first place for this EO to start. That as we're going to be migrating more and more to the cloud, we need to take a good hard look at FedRAMP and use the FedRAMP infrastructure that exists to set to raise the waterline, right? To move the cybersecurity benchmark for all of the FedRAMP program participants and give the government a higher floor, if you will, of cybersecurity protections for all of their apparatus that is going to be operating from FedRAMP approved systems. The thing that jumps out at me about the EO, or a lot of things jump out at me, but one of the things, you mentioned the cloud service providers. One of the progressions that I think we are seeing, for years, DoD cybersecurity attention has been focused on the data. They have established minimum cybersecurity requirements for contractors based on the sensitivity of the data, the controlled unclassified information that contractors are storing or creating or using in the performance of their federal contracts. And then the government's regulations, their contract standards, have sort of followed the information. If you have that information on your information system, then that information system is going to have to meet some basic cybersecurity requirements, right? NIST 800-171, 853 if it's a government system. I think the big difference now, the EO is signaling that the CSPs are going to have to provide some degree of cyber threat monitoring and protection and reporting for any of their systems, not just the systems that they are using in the performance of a government contract or to store and safeguard government information, but all of their systems. And the government, it appears they're going to use this EO as a launch pad to kind of telescope into the CSP networks just to get better, broader situational awareness of the threats that exist in the industry writ large, not necessarily the threats that are specifically targeting either the government information that's on a system or a system that is holding that government information. So in that respect, I see this as being a real expansion, if you will, of the scope of information that the government is trying to get its arms around, and the scope of the reporting it's going to require of its CSP contractors, and the scope of collaboration that it's going to require those CSPs to give, both in terms of not only reporting, but also, threat monitoring and deploying safeguards that are going to protect all of these systems, not just the systems that the government is using maybe specifically for its work or its contractors' work. But I get the sense too, beyond these kind of high level 30,000 foot policy oriented changes, there's a lot of technical changes that are baked into this EO too. I mean, we've got the migration to zero trust architecture, multi-factor authentication, encryption of data in transit, encryption of data at rest. And Megan, Matt, what do you make of those, and where are the real puts for industry to have to lean in here?
I think the way you just framed it, John, was really helpful to say it's almost like a paradigm shift. Instead of looking at the data, we're looking at the systems. And I think that's really exemplified with this emphasis on zero trust architecture. This is not a new concept. NIST has been looking at zero trust principles to help the federal government move in that direction. They have a special publication that's already out, 800-207. But to take a step back, the concept is, and it's defined in section 10K of the executive order, if you want to read it. I've heard lots of people say they think this is a good definition of zero trust, which is a fairly nebulous concept. But it basically says that zero trust is a security model or a set of design principles and network management that assumes and acknowledges that threats exist and are inside and outside your network boundaries. And so what it really says is it kind of is the principle of least privilege, which says, don't trust anyone, assume bad guys are in your system, and make sure that you're only giving network access to folks who really need it. The line that jumped out at me was, it allows users full access, but only the bare minimum they need to perform their jobs. And so, what it's doing here is it's telling the federal government and its cloud service providers, we're going to expect you to move to zero trust. Now, I think a challenge there is, what precisely will that mean in any one contract or one program? When NIST put out 800-207, several private sector commenters noted for the government that it may not be super easy to implement, right? There's not one way to do zero trust. And it does have trade-offs to, say, usability, right? You're now going to have barriers to accessing certain things. You're going to have to know your system and your users a lot better than the government currently does. And so I expect some implementation challenges there for the government, particularly for legacy systems, and then sort of understanding with the contractor what decisions the contractor's making along the way. I mean, Matt does a lot of work under these special publications and helping with compliance. You do too, John. And there's a lot of judgment calls that get made along the way, that it's not just sort of a one size fit all. It's more of a choose your own adventure when you're implementing some of these concepts. So I think OMB is going to make some form of zero trust mandatory for CSPs. I think other contractors are going to have to understand zero trust and be able to explain what they're doing with that. And I think they're going to be nudging the private sector, even for non-contractors. NIST has a proceeding right now open for sort of zero trust guidelines for the private sector. But Matt, I know we've talked a lot about multi-factor and encryption, depending on what clients need. But what was your reaction to the EO's discussion of that?
Yeah, this is one of the small pieces in the EO, but something that potentially might have a very big impact. So the EO says that within 180 days, federal agencies shall adopt multi-factor authentication, MFA, and encryption for data at rest and in transit to the maximum extent possible. And if an agency can't adopt MFA and encryption, they must provide a written rationale to DHS. So that's what's required. This is clearly directed first at the federal government, right? But I think this is one of those areas where the administration really is hoping to change the standards for cybersecurity generally for the federal government and the private sector. This is somewhat reminiscent of the cyber sprints for the federal government that they did in the wake of the OPM breach several years ago, where agencies were given a short time frame to institute certain improvements in their cybersecurity, like switching to require TLS 1.1 for encrypting all web traffic. But those cyber sprints from several years ago were more designed to catch the federal government up to where the private sector already was. That's not the case here with MFA and encryption. This is perhaps a very significant change. I mean, I think right now I would say most companies use MFA for administrator accounts, but not for regular user accounts. And similarly, I would say encryption for data in transit is common, but encrypting data at rest is not usually the case. And there's good reasons why the private sector has made these distinctions. Both encryption and MFA clearly have security benefits. There's no doubt about that. But they're also costly to implement, and they can impact speed and functionality throughout your network, depending on what you're doing. So the EO's push to want to make encryption and MFA the default for everyone in the federal government at the least, that would be a huge change. It would be a really dramatic shift if that were to become the case for the federal government and then to become the expectation for the private sector. But I'm curious to see if the federal government can really do this in the timeframes announced in the EO. I'm personally very skeptical of the government's ability to pull this off. And I think in about 6 months from now, we're going to see that more agencies have come forward and provided written explanations to DHS saying why they couldn't meet this requirement. And you're not going to see a whole lot of agencies that are going to come forward and say, yeah, we were able to do this across the board. So that's my expectation for how this is going to go for the federal government.
Yeah, well, and I think, Matt, we've seen that with defense contractors that are trying to manage the NIST 800-171 requirements. I feel like some of these encryption and multi-factor authentication requirements, they're the last mile in terms of the implementation of those requirements. Those are the ones that are the most resource intensive, that require the most planning on the part of the contractor. So at least the contractor's experience in implementing those pieces to this point, that's always been, I don't know if it's the hardest point, but it always seems to be the last part of compliance that they're baking in. And so for the government to prioritize that, I'm glad to see it. But I think you're right that it poses some real resource challenges.
Yeah, I mean, MFA within 801.71, I mean, that was a fight. Then it was included, and it's been, I don't know officially what the numbers are, but if you look at a lot of entities' POAMs for 801.71, I think MFA is probably on a lot of them. That would be my guess. John and Megan, one of the things that the EO talks a lot about is threat detection on federal networks. What are your views on that?
Well, let me field that at a high level. I mean, I think clearly the government wants to improve its ability to identify threats that may exist both in the industry writ large and specifically threats to their information systems. They want to have the ability to better deter those threats, to prevent them, and then to be in a position to respond to them when there is a cyber incident. So all the ambitions that the EO is setting out to attain, I think they're pretty noble, and we'd all agree that they're very good. It's interesting the scope with which the EO is attempting to implement those ambitions. We talked earlier at the outset of this podcast about how the new requirements that are going to be imposed on the CSPs are fairly significant. It's a significant expansion of the information that the government is getting versus what they have required to this point. One thing I find interesting in sort of the prologue to Section 2 of the EO, they're suggesting that there are contract terms and restrictions that limit the sharing of cyber threat or incident information between the contractors and the government. I'm not so sure I buy that a whole lot. I mean, there's nothing in, at least not that I'm aware of, language in the contracts that say the contractors may not share this information with the government, or the contractors are prohibited from sharing threat information. I think that the government to this point just maybe hasn't done as rigorous of a job as it's planning to do going forward of asking for that information or requiring it and doing it on a more standardized basis, right? Not treating information sharing as an ad hoc thing that gets negotiated on a contract by contract basis with one CSP versus the other. They're going to try and standardize the process and standardize the requirements for what that'll look like. But when we start diving into what they've outlined as the requirements they intend to impose, they're broad. As I mentioned before, they intend to require CSPs to collect and preserve data, information, and reporting relevant to cybersecurity, event prevention, detection, response, and investigation on all information systems over which they have control. And that suggests to me that it's going to be information systems that are beyond the scope of what the government may be using. And that one in particular strikes me. I worry that there's going to be a market shift by industry to respond to that requirement, right? If industry is in a position where they now have to report to the government cyber incidents on all of their networks, well, is that going to cause industry to kind of realign itself to have more government-specific businesses, right? You're going to have a line of not just a product line, but maybe you're going to have a federal subsidiary that is going to do federal cloud and not do commercial cloud. And so instead of having this, the ability to leverage economies of scale between the commercial and the federal sector, is this going to do the opposite? Is this going to drive the cloud service providers to rethink their business models and have dedicated federal subsidiaries, entire separate lines of business, so that they can try to cabin off their commercial business from some of these federal reporting and monitoring requirements? One of the things that may really drive that in Section 2, there is a requirement, or there will be a requirement for CSPs to implement technical capabilities such as monitoring networks for threats in collaboration with the agencies that they support. I'm really interested to see what that monitoring looks like. Mm-hmm. And it's one thing to say, okay, CSPs, you're going to have some sort of threat monitoring capability that you're implementing on your networks, and when you detect something that may be reportable, let us know. That's one thing. It's a whole other thing if the monitoring that's going to be required is, the FBI or the NSA being able to put a sniffer on your network so that the agency can be looking for those markers of some sort of a cyber incident. I think that's going to be a really different animal for commercial industry to stomach. It's not uncommon in the government world, right? Like the Navy's been doing this for some of their really high priority programs that have really sensitive information going back a couple of years now. If they determine that there is sensitive information and that there's a credible risk on a contractor network, they've exercised some authority to come in and actually put some government monitoring capabilities on contractor networks. Really different when you start talking about commercial CSPs that are providing government capability, government contractor capability, and maybe unrelated commercial capability that is wholly separate from that. So I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't I don't want to say that I do, but I'm really concerned about how that requirement for monitoring is implemented. There's the possibility that it could drive a big industry segmentation here that might be an unintended consequence of that requirement.
One thing I'll jump in real quick on that. I mean, the EO talks about the contract barriers. I'm skeptical about that as well. What I do see are more valid contract barriers are your contractors that have a government and commercial mixed system. Adding a federal monitoring capability onto that system is going to violate their commercial contracts for confidentiality provisions and the like. That's what I see as a barrier. And I don't see how the EO can override those contractual requirements. That doesn't make sense to me. So I have concern with that as well.
Well, I think the other thing that's really jumped out at me about this is this threat monitoring and threat hunting concept is not new. The government's been sort of chasing this capability for a while, right? The Cyberspace Solarium Commission really made some strong recommendations about this. The National Defense Authorization Act last round started out, the House version had a very robust authorization for threat hunting. That got watered down to a study. But then once DOD's study is done, it looks like they want to proceed with authorizing threat hunting on contractor networks. And I just have to, the conversation seems to have jumped so far ahead in terms of stepping over some of the threshold questions of the type you guys were noting, but also to pick up on Matt's point about confidentiality from enterprise contract perspective, there's privacy and civil liberties concerns here, right? I mean, when Einstein was set up many years ago, there was a hue and cry from some civil justice type organizations that they thought it was too invasive of monitoring web traffic going to federal systems. This is far beyond that. And so it strikes me that really some thought needs to be given to what this looks like and how this could put contractors in a tough spot, but also what kind of aggrandizement of government surveillance powers does this seemingly start us down the road? So that's sort of my reaction to this provision is, the idea has been around and the EO sort of slid it in here. I wonder about the authority for it. I wonder about the scope of it. But it certainly is of some concern, I think, to a lot of folks in the private sector.
So, Matt, one of the things that struck me is we're talking about the scope and expanse of this. And we've talked about scope and expanse in terms of information systems and CSPs. Internet of Things is a not insignificant piece of this, too. What's your take on the pilot program for IoT?
Yeah, so the EO, as you mentioned, creates a pilot program for IoT cybersecurity. It's to be done by NIST with input from the FTC. And specifically, the idea is for NIST to come up with IoT cybersecurity criteria for a consumer labeling program. And the EO further directs that NIST shall develop criteria that, among other things, reflect increasingly comprehensive levels of testing and assessment that a product may have undergone. So that's kind of what's in the EO. Stepping back for a moment, kind of big picture, I think it's fair to say that cybersecurity for IoT devices has been a concern for some time. Of course, lots of devices have appropriate cybersecurity for whatever their intended use is. But one of the big concerns here has been that lots of IoT devices had little or no security, and they had stuff like passwords that were 1234, that were baked into the firmware, and that couldn't be changed by end users or were really hard to change. That created a problem because those types of devices were getting swept up into botnets very, very easily, and they could be used for all kinds of bad things like launching really powerful DDoS attacks. So I think that that's been a concern in the background for a while. But my reaction to the EO is that this has been addressed, and there have been lots of different efforts to address this over the last several years. So the first one probably is the California IoT security law, which was designed specifically to respond to that problem. Several other states are following suit. Similarly, the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020 attempts to address this for the federal government and IoT devices that are sold to the government. Industry groups have also developed standards for IoT security and labeling programs. And in fact, NIST has been working on this as well. NIST has the NIST 8259A, which is the IoT device cybersecurity capability core baseline. And NIST has also expressed interest in IoT labeling. They've recently released a draft white paper called Establishing Confidence in IoT Device Security, which is looking at this and is out for comment at the moment. So it's not clear that this new effort by NIST is really needed. And at the same time, the cost of meeting the, quote, increasingly comprehensive levels of testing and assessment that NIST has been tasked with developing might be significant. So I'm worried about this effort and that it may not add a lot of value on top of existing efforts, but at the same time might create a lot of cost for IoT manufacturers. This is one area that I think anybody who's making IoT devices really needs to pay a lot of attention to. This is one of the two pilot programs in the EO. Megan, do you want to talk about the other one?
Yeah, so the EO, this is where the executive order sort of grabs a few ideas that have been kicking around and sort of puts them on paper. One is the IoT labeling that Matt has talked about. Some folks really are fans of the idea of an IoT label. I share some of Matt's skepticism for all the reasons he said, but for the additional reason that I think it's highly likely to be very difficult to pull off in a way that is helpful to consumers. It's difficult to communicate complex technical information to consumers, and I think this is a challenge, and the government in a pilot program can probably learn a lot, but we shall see. The second pilot program is about consumer software labeling, and it's addressed in the executive order. I think it's section 4U and the surrounding subsections, but the idea is that NIST with the FTC and maybe other agencies as appropriate is going to identify secure software development practices or criteria for a consumer software labeling program and look to other labeling programs as maybe exemplars. And here, I think the White House's fact sheet talked about modeling it on the Energy Star program. The Energy Star is a moderately successful program. Some are skeptical of it, that rates the energy efficiency of certain appliances, et cetera. You can get an Energy Star label. Lots of studies have been done as to whether that's truly effective. Does it really help? I will just note it has generated litigation and compliance uncertainties. So to me, this is not sort of an easy thing to pull off in a way that is both helpful in communicating but also doesn't subject the private sector to a lot of risk and burdens. And, we'll see what the market is, I suppose, for a consumer software label that talks about, say, secure development life cycles. And I'll just note, I think that's going to be challenging. I also think it runs a risk of, picking maybe one software development approach over another. Software development isn't static, right? It's moved from my software development expert clients will tell me it's moved from waterfall to agile to open. And so I think there's lots of ways that software gets developed. And I would hate to see the government sort of pick one that might rapidly become sort of disfavored or that might limit experimentation in those kinds of areas, even if consumers are going to be interested in the secure software development lifecycle used for a product that they're purchasing.
Related to that, Megan, the EO has additional requirements for what it calls critical software. What is critical software, and what can you tell us about that?
Oh, critical software. So this is section 4 of the executive order. And, everyone's this is a reaction in part to the SolarWinds incident we discussed at the outset, but it has sort of 2 tracks with the goal of improving software security, both development practices and actual operations. They call out a category called critical software that is not defined in the executive order, but that NIST has been tasked with defining. And once that is sort of defined, federal agencies and DHS is going to make a list of critical software, and sort of additional requirements are going to be imposed on that. There's a second track of activity where they're going to be putting out general software security guidance for the private sector. One interesting piece of all of this is its inclusion of this concept called SBOM, which is Software Bill of Materials. This has been a project at the Department of Commerce's NTIA for several years now, kind of like an ingredients list for your software. And it's quite challenging, I think, to pull off. There's been some work on it at NTIA, all thus far, non-regulatory and voluntary, but the EO picks up the SBOM concept and certainly propels it towards more of a mandatory approach. I think we can expect to see SBOM obligations in critical software that is acquired by the federal government and maybe beyond that. So I think the software tracks are very interesting in Section 4 because they're moving very rapidly, and there's a lot of undefined terms that are going to be very important to the FAR Council down the road when they have to start creating contract clauses for acquisition of software.
I want to jump in on Section 4 there for a second. I know we're going to spend the entirety of episode 2 in this multi-part podcast talking about the government contracts implications specifically of the CEO, of which they are aplenty. But there are a couple things that jump out at me in Section 4 that, from a government contracts counseling perspective, just when I was going through the EO for the first time with my highlighter, I mean, there are entire sections in Section 4 that are, I scribbled over them on my highlighter so much I wore through the darn page. I think that, again, noble concepts, noble ambitions by the government, but gosh, the practicality of some of the ambition here it's staggering to try and get my arms around. As I go through the different technical requirements that, you mentioned the software bill of materials, the attestations as to the provenance of the software, the requirements for encryption to be baked into the software being developed in a secure environment. Okay, these are all great things, but let's stop here. Now we're also going to require contractors to warn and represent to the government that their software products meet all of these standards. Okay, that's a reasonable ask. It's going to force software vendors to assume a not insignificant degree of contract and regulatory risk here. But then, to the extent that software manufacturers are not able to make that representation, the consequences here are pretty significant. The government's going to remove those software products from all of its umbrella type contracts, all of its IDIQ contracts. So GSA schedule contract, gone. Agency multi-ordering contracts, gone. Okay, I can take that, right? If we're going to try and manage the supply chain and manage supply chain integrity, these, again, they are noble concepts. But then we get to the next step where we're going to start looking at legacy software architectures, and we're going to identify legacy software products that do not meet those requirements, and then we're going to take steps to either remove or remediate them. How the heck are we going to do that, right? Like, there must be thousands of legacy software products floating around different government agencies, literally thousands. There might be tens of thousands. And for the vast majority of those legacy software architectures, the government doesn't have the code for it, right? Like, the government's buying commercial executable software, and it's not getting the code in the software. So how are they going to do any remediation? They don't have the code, so they can't go in and remediate the code. They just have the executable files. In some cases, it may be executable files from companies that aren't even manufacturing the software anymore, making it available. So then you're left with rip and replace. I mean, I've been involved in legacy software system migrations involving government systems. They never go as planned. They are hard. They are resource intensive, and they are really dirty. Dirty in the sense that things go wrong and have to be fixed in schedules shift to the right, cost goes up, and it's never something that is executed seamlessly, right? So I look at this expectation that we're going to have a new normal for software development, and that all of the software products coming off the line are going to be warranted by the vendors to meet all of these lofty technical requirements, and that all of our legacy software products, none of which were built to any of those lofty requirements, all of those are going to have to be either fixed or replaced. I just don't know if that is a practical expectation, and if it's something that the government is really interested in doing. It's going to take a lot of time and money and effort. And I'm sure that there are contractors that are going to raise their hand and step into the void to take that work on. It's going to be a great opportunity, but it's going to be a lot of work. And I feel like it kind of got buried in the EO. I don't know if that's a signal that the effort will also be buried and eventually kind of marginalized. But if the government expects to go full bore on this, it's going to take a ton of industry effort to get from where we are now to where the EO suggests that the government wants to be in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think calls for reform of how the federal government purchases and manages its IT systems and software have always included the need for massive amounts of spend that I'm just not sure the government is prepared to undertake. The other thing that I think comes through from your comments is one thing I found kind of missing from the EO, but hopefully will come through in the implementation, is a risk-based approach, right? Some of these things are great for certain settings or for certain areas. But one concern is that you take what, for example, DoD's been doing and you apply it across the civilian agencies. That might not be the right solution. It might be overkill. So I think my hope is NIST, which does have a lot of supply chain risk management learning. People have been looking at software supply chain for a while. There's several working groups. There's several intergovernment activities. I hope that they will be bringing a risk-based approach to it that will trickle through to the FAR Council, et cetera, because I think that's going to be, a challenge to avoid sort of over-regulating and over-rotating on some of these issues. I think we're going to tax our listeners' patience, but I want to cover one or two more things. Matt, the EO does address incident response, which I think there has been a long history of both perceived and reality that the government maybe doesn't handle incidents quite the way it expects the private sector to. And they've been taking steps to rectify that. But what is going on in the EO with sort of this federal incident response playbook? Can you give us a sense of what that looks like and how it might affect the private sector?
Yeah, so Section 6 of the EO calls for a standardized playbook for the federal government to have to respond to various cyber incidents. I think just kind of my top level takeaway is that sounds like a very good idea. The way it works right now is that agencies and departments will have incident response policies, but that they're more specific for that agency, and there's not really communication across agencies, and it's not very standardized. So kind of pulling all that together makes a lot of sense to me. In terms of impact on the private sector, the White House fact sheet that accompanied the EO said expressly that they intend for this playbook to provide the private sector with a template for its response efforts. I think, first of all, this already exists in a lot of ways. NIST 861 provides guidance to the private sector for how to develop an incident response policy. That guidance in 861 includes, Megan, just what you were talking about, a flexible risk-based approach. Like it talks about post-cyber incident, the organization should contact law enforcement if appropriate. It says things like organizations should balance the benefits of information sharing with the drawbacks of sharing sensitive information. Appropriate, flexible, risk-based language. And so I hope that whatever the federal government develops for the standardized playbook also carries over those ideas. The one thing in Section 6 that I noticed that did give me a little bit of pause was the inclusion of the word vulnerabilities. Section 6 talks about standardizing the cybersecurity vulnerability and incident response procedures currently used to identify, remediate, and recover from vulnerabilities and incidents. To me, there's a big difference between incident response and vulnerability management. Those are just two different concepts that, in my mind, require different approaches. And I'm worried about DHS, when they come up with this playbook, reaching out on the vulnerability front and making normative judgments about things like how frequently patches should be mitigated. That is a whole separate discussion, but the short version is that vulnerability management in the real world is a very complicated, hard process. It's not as easy as, patch criticals in 30 days, high and medium in 60, and low in 90 days. It's not that simple. So I'm curious if DHS is going to wade into some of those normative judgments with respect to vulnerability.
But I think that's one of the areas that, if we look to the DoD cybersecurity rules as an analog, I would expect they're going to be looking to NIST to do a lot of the legwork for, setting standards and coming up with some industry baselines that they can use, because they do want to have objective standards. I realize 30, 60, 90 days, maybe that's not going to be the practical way to express the standard, but they're going to want to have something that is objective benchmarks so that they can say, hey, here's what the expectation is, now go and do.
Yeah, as long as that is, has the flexible language in there to recognize that you don't always patch, all vulnerabilities within that time frame, and that there's appropriate security reasons to not do so. So we'll see how that develops. John, for what I think is our last topic of the day, I'll turn to you. I did want to talk about the effort in the EO to standardize contractual language for cybersecurity across the federal government. So what's kind of the current landscape, and what do you expect for this standardization effort?
This is an area that I've been following now for probably 15 years. And when I first started looking at cybersecurity requirements in government contracts, I was really surprised to see how parochial the treatment was. Every agency had its own requirements. Within an agency, different programs, different contracts had different requirements. And there was a complete and total absence of any kind of standardization of the expectations at any point across the industry. And so when contractors ran into problems, right? When if a contractor came and said, hey, we had an incident that involves a government program we're working on, what do we have to do? It was just trying to figure out what the standards of care and what the contractual requirements that contractor may have been subject to was an effort unto itself. So I saw the Department of Defense's evolution over the last decade of what is now the Safeguarding Covered Defense Information Rule, DFARS 252, 204, 7012. That evolution has been real progress, I think, because for the first time we had an agency say, hey, we need standards. We need to have a common baseline that can give everybody a common language to speak in. It can give our contracting officers some objective measures to target, and it gives the contractors some common baselines across multiple agencies that they can use on their systems and have like a single target to shoot at. So DoD has been down this road. They've done it in fits and starts. I think back to, I think it was 2012 when they issued the first interim rule or interim final rule. And it was kind of explosive when these requirements first came out. Just as it is now, just as this EO is a big deal in industry, that was a big deal in the defense industry 10, 11 years ago. But I think that DoD's progress gives us some expectation of what might come out of this effort. Number one, it gives us some shoulders to stand on. To your point, Matt, earlier, I hope that the FAR Council, in implementing some of the recommendations or the requirements in the EO, will look to DoD's experience as some guidance in how they can roll out some of these requirements. I fully expect, given these timelines, 60, 90, 120 days, these are super, super aggressive, super fast by the standards of traditional federal procurement regulatory changes, right? Because all of these new contract requirements that are discussed throughout the EO, they are going to be implemented through revisions to the FAR and the DFARs. They're going to be implemented as a rulemaking process. So in the traditional rulemaking process, there would be a proposed rule that gets put out for notice and comment. Industry would have an opportunity to provide comment. The FAR councils would digest those comments, maybe make some changes, and then issue a final rule. That whole process, for normal issues, that whole process might take anywhere from 1 to 3 years. They don't have the luxury of time to comply with the EO here. So what I expect we're going to see are several interim final rules, or rules that will come out not as proposed rules for notice and comment, but actually implemented rules for which they will take notice and comment and potentially revise the rules on down the road. That's what DoD did a little bit in fits and spurts in implementing the Safeguarding Covered Defense Information Rule. They did some of the rulemaking through traditional proposed notice and comment, but a lot of it was done through interim rule changes. I expect that's what we're going to see here. It's going to be a bevy of interim rules that come out this summer. They're going to take notice and comment from industry on how they can improve the rules, where there's ambiguity, what can they do better. And then over the course of the next probably 18 months, maybe even 2 years, they will tweak and revise those interim rules to come up with something that's going to be the final. I think this is going to put a lot of burden on industry, right? We've seen the bogey move in the compliance regime for DoD's rule over the last decade. Every time there's been a revision, industry has had to kind of pivot and catch up. I think that there's going to be a lot of pivoting and catching up as we are now expanding these cybersecurity requirements, not just to DoD contractors, but to civilian agency contractors and CSPs and the like. There's going to be a lot of industry that has a lot of ground to make up, and they're going to have to do it relatively quickly because these interim rules are going to come fast and furious over the next few months. And I don't expect that they are going to provide a real lengthy grace period for contractors to fall in line and to get caught up. So not to be all doom and gloom, but I just think the next probably 3 to 6 months are going to be a bit of a wild ride in this space for the government contracting industry. And I think the next 6 to 18 or 24 months is going to be a time of real investment and activity as they are trying to bring their information systems into compliance with the new standard cybersecurity clauses and requirements that are going to be imposed. They're going to bring their network monitoring into compliance with the monitoring and disclosure rules. They're going to bring their software build practices into compliance with the new supply chain integrity measures that are here. There's a lot for government contractors, just an awful lot for the industry to digest and react to and execute.
Well, that's a great summary. That ending note, John, was really apt in terms of there's a lot to digest in the next few months to maybe 18 months. And so folks who may not have traditionally focused on the FAR Council or NIST probably need to be Googling like mad in the near term and calling their trusted advisors to figure out what's going on and how best to insert into those processes to make sure that what pops out of NIST or the FAR Council is risk-based and practical. But